Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Densel, and I host Unfound, and I run this YouTube channel. I realize you don't want to give a thumbs up to the following video until you watch it. You know what? That's totally understandable. I can appreciate that. But what you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. The button is right there. Thanks.
Stephen Allan Davis was a 23-year-old from San Francisco, California. He was a musician who had an older sister and two younger brothers. On Halloween 1986, a Friday, Stephen told people he was going to a friend's party, then heading back to his hometown about 30 minutes away. Stephen never arrived at either place. He was never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. I spend a lot of time on these episodes, the live show, and the presentations I've done at universities, talking about the most common types of disappearances. By this time, many of you can probably name them. The man said, drugs play a role, it's a murder, but, etc. Then the question is, what is the rarest? Or more precisely, what kind of person is the least likely to disappear? I can answer that. A single person with no physical or mental health issues or addictions and no money concerns. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when we've featured cases covering a person such as this, that these are Unfound's biggest mysteries. Jason Jolkowski, April Andrews, Jesse Ross, Stephen Kocher, Kristen Modafferi, Mary Jane Van Gilder. In all of those, any theory is possible, other than them being beamed up to the mothership. Well, today with Stephen Davis, we have another one of those. A guy living his life in a way that made him unlikely to disappear. Or was he? What happened to the Frisco Kid? And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Linus' website, CHARLEYproject.org. Steve Davis came from a musical family. In fact, right before his disappearance, Steve had done some recordings with his friends and had been talking about getting a tape of that session. However, Steve had a backup plan in case the music didn't work out. He had moved to San Francisco and eventually got a job in the mailroom at the oil company Chevron. Hey, everybody has to start somewhere. But Steve wasn't in the city alone. His friend of many years, George, lived close by and had actually helped Steve find an apartment. Everything seemed to be going smoothly as possible in Steve's life. So on Friday, October 31st, 1986, Steve finished his week on a high note, telling his supervisor that it was his best week at Chevron. Steve then went food shopping. According to Steve's own words earlier that week, that evening he planned to take the half-hour trip by bus back to his hometown and stay the weekend. On the way, though, Steve planned to stop and pick up that demo tape previously mentioned at a friend's, Steve Haverness's. Coincidentally, this friend was also having a Halloween party. Steve had invited George to go to it, but he declined. Steve allegedly never arrived at the party and never picked up that tape. He was never seen again. A search of his apartment showed no signs of violence, the door was locked, and the receipt from the food shopping was there. About 10% of Unfound's disappearances have been solved since our coverage, and rarely are the resolutions surprises. Why? Because what is known leads us most of the time to very probable conclusions. Yet today is different. So please think about these 3 questions as you listen to the rest of this episode. Number 1, why didn't Steve's friend seem that concerned when Steve didn't show up for the party or the tape? Number 2, if Steve's life was going so well, why did he give to people close to him the impression he might be leaving it? And number 3, San Francisco police dismissed it at the time, but now in 2022, should we consider the possibility that Steve might have been murdered due to his friendship with a married woman? Steve's family is just as puzzled now as they were in 1986, but they can't help but lean toward a foul play scenario. The guest for this episode is Steve's sister, Susie Davis. Unfound News. Dr. Telesco and I were due to have another show next Thursday, April 28th. However, due to some conflicts, we've pushed our get-together to May 12th. And for the first time, we'll be covering a solved Unfound disappearance. Next, I hope you all enjoyed, if you got through all of it, the 4-hour-long Q&A episode. I love answering all of your unique questions. However, I may be changing the scheduling to 3 times a year so as to keep the length a bit shorter. Finally, next Friday, update episode number 11. I haven't started compiling the information yet, but my perception is there isn't a ton of new information on the disappearances Unfound has covered. But maybe I'm wrong.
Where you can find Unfound: Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, Podbean, and many other platforms, especially outside the United States. Unfound has social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, join me on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Unfound Podcast Channel for the live show, the only one of its kind in true crime. Ask questions, chat with other viewers, and give the show a thumbs up. You can contribute to Unfound in the following ways: patreon.com/Unfound Podcast, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. Contribute during the live show with the Super Chat. And lastly, join the YouTube membership program for the low price of 10 cents a day. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. And please mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you.
I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Steve Davis, Susie Davis. Susie, welcome to Unfound. Hello to you. Let's start here. Let's just talk about your family. Of course, you are Steve's sister. How many siblings do you have? What was the Davis family like in the 1980s? Maybe just give the listeners/viewers a little feel for that to start.
Okay, well, let's see. There was 4 siblings. I was the oldest sister. Steve was second and was 4 years younger than me, but was the oldest boy.
Mhm.
And let's see, in the in the 70s, my parents had discovered the counterculture and had basically embraced the counterculture to the point where I would say we were all kind of hippies through the whole 70s, and which I myself loved. You get to wear the coolest clothes.
Okay.
And by the 80s, let's see, we were trying to put it all together. I mean, by the time of Steve's disappearance, my parents had already split up, and my dad was living in Woodacre, and my mom was living in Fairfax. But both Steve and myself lived with my mom for a while until we sort of, got on our own two legs. I think I moved out when I was 24 for the last time. I'd moved out, come back, moved out, come back, and Steve moved out sometime when he was around 22, I think.
Okay. All right. So you had other siblings, and what was like the age dispersion between all of them? Just off the
So
cuff.
I'm the oldest. Steve's 4 years younger. Sean is 2 years younger than Steve, and Scott is 4 years younger than Sean.
Wow, you're the only girl and three boys.
Yeah.
How was that? How was that, Susie?
Well, it was great growing up because I got to be like play mom with, my adorable younger brothers. It was great.
Okay.
I always was like mom number two.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. So a little bit of a hippie family. Unfortunately, parents, or maybe fortunately, depending on how everybody felt about it, I guess your family, your parents get divorced. And by that time, it sounds like the mid 80s. Of course, we know what Steve's age were. You were a little older than that.
Mhm.
Maybe kind of a little bit out on your own, finding your own way. And of course, we're going to talk about how Steve eventually moved to San
Mhm.
Francisco. So we have a good idea of the family dynamics. And so let's just move on to talk about Steve specifically. Maybe starting here, being that you had two other brothers besides Steve, would you say that Steve kind of was a little bit different from them, all kind of the same personalities? How would you explain Steve compared to your other brothers?
Oh, well, he being the oldest, and being an Aries, if you go for astrology, he was
Okay.
very, very much the leader of the boys. Um, but all the boys were really creative, and it was really fun watching them grow up because they were all drawn to music and art. And Steve was especially instrumental in getting his brothers involved in they made a lot of movies. They would, come up with skits and act them out. And then he also did a ton of claymation shorts using
Oh
a
yeah.
Super 8
Yes.
camera, which,
Yes.
you know, they don't have any kind of professional quality, but he loved doing it, and he'd get, Sean and Scott involved. And so he was always a real ringleader with the boys. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, interesting. Was he into into sports? How did he do in school? What about those aspects of his life?
I think he did fine in school. Super smart kid. He only did a year or so of college at SF State, and then he dropped out, and I can't tell you why he did, but after a year or so, he ended up getting a job as a bike messenger, and that's when he moved into his friend Henry's apartment.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
I'm sorry if I didn't answer the question. I might have gone off on a tangent
That's all
there.
right. No, we're here to talk about what you want to talk about. I just try to guide the conversation. That's
Okay.
totally fine. Maybe I just in general, how did he do in school? Was he a good student? Apply himself, or was he one
I
maybe kind of a slacker? Do you even know?
No, he definitely was. Definitely applied himself.
Hmm.
He liked to be the best. He liked to win. If he had any shortcomings, it was that he was not a very gracious loser.
I know.
I
I
remember
got a little bit of
some,
my. I'm not an Aries, but I know that
yeah,
feeling. Yes.
a few incidents over board games that were not particularly pleasant.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, he had a very strong personality and a lot of drive. He was a self-taught musician and was a songwriter, and he was fascinated with vintage horror movies and
Wow.
loved Ray Harryhausen movies and loved the Beatles and was really into boxing. And he has notebooks full of lists that he made when he was a young adult, of all the lists of like all the actors who played Bela Lugosi and rated by the best to the worst, and all the Ray Harryhausen movies and every fight that Mike Tyson ever did. And he just
Wow.
loved to make lists and,
Mhm.
categorize things and quantify things. And, every Beatles song written by George Harrison. So
Yeah.
when we look at his notebooks, which I have been recently hoping to find a little glimpse into his personal life, it's just lists.
Mhm.
And then all of his writing was just creative writing, was him making up stories, and very, very sort of creative and kind of offhand way. Like, I don't know if you ever read any of John Lennon's
Mm-mm.
writing that he did. It's just very playful, very
Yeah.
comedic. So yeah, he was always creating something.
Okay. And you
Yeah.
mentioned, of course, the music, and that's going to be a factor later, of course, in the discussion when we start talking about
Mhm.
the music that he was making and everything. But I do have to ask, and we're not going to get deep into this, but being that you were his older sister, and of course, you had a music career, do you think he was inspired by you, or was this just something he came upon by himself?
I think he was very inspired. I talked to one of his best friends recently, and he told me Steve was so proud of me and what I'd done in music. And that was really nice
Wow.
to hear, because often with siblings, you don't go, man, I'm so proud of what you're
Yeah.
doing. Um, but yeah, I think he was inspired. And
Hmm. Interesting. Has
yeah,
to make you feel good. Wow.
that
Neat.
was really nice to hear that.
Yeah. Let's just so thank you for that. Very interesting. What about his friends? We're going to be talking about some of these guys that he knew, but would you say he made friends easily? You said maybe he didn't like to lose, and we're going to get into that. You've told me about maybe a little outspoken, confrontational side of his personality, but what would you say regarding his friends? Would you say that he made them easily? Did he have those close friends, and how did that all go on when he did move from his hometown and went to San Francisco? How did he keep in touch with them? What went on there? Do you know?
Yeah, I think Steve was not the kind of guy who had a lot of friends. He had a few close personal friends. He was really tight with our family and with his brothers. And I think, the family was really at the center of his world. So I know George is one of his best friends from middle school, and also his friend Steve Habernas. But I was 4 years older, and I was starting to get involved in music. And
Yeah.
I'd moved out a couple times, so our social lives didn't intertwine that much. So as far as I knew George, because I'd seen him around for years, and he was a cool kid, but I don't even remember meeting other friends of Steve's right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about relationships? Girlfriends, like when he was in high school?
Hmm.
Any intimate relationships, personal relationships that he had, either in his hometown or what do you know about that?
Yep. No, he didn't really. I didn't know him to have any girlfriends. He never showed up with any girls. I didn't hear stories about him with girls or guys.
Okay, whatever. Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Nothing like that. Okay.
he's kind of like, like a lot of creative people. You get very obsessed with your projects that you want to do and you make, and
Yeah.
it's hard to find somebody who's going to fit into that.
That's right. I am one of those people, and hence the reason
Yeah.
I'm single at 51. So I certainly know that type of situation, when you get passionate about things, certainly, of course.
Mhm.
Okay.
And when he did end up getting involved with women, I did not meet them. At that point, we were running in pretty different circles.
Well, maybe I should ask you that, being that you had moved out and were doing,
Mhm.
you had your own career. How often would you say, let's just say between 1984, 85, and when he went missing in 1986, how many times would you say you personally saw him or talked to him?
Oh God, honey,
Just a guess.
hard to say, but I would say, you know, I would probably see him at least every couple of months.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
he would come to shows. It depends. I think so in 84, 85, I was out on the road with the Purple Rain tour for like 7 months. So that's a long period of time. And as you can imagine, I was super caught up in the excitement of
Right.
that.
Huge. It's
Amazing.
huge.
And so I think 84 was when, I was just doing my thing and he was doing his thing. And that's when we kind of lost touch with each other. Although, anytime I was home, I would go up and see my family and we'd get together. We had very tight family. My mom was pretty amazing at bringing everybody together. My dad had a new girlfriend at that point, and my mom was just like, no, just bring her over. It's fine. We're all a family.
That's nice.
Yeah, so we were really close. And so yeah, so there were long periods of time where I didn't see him. I may have sent postcards or talked on the phone, but yeah, I
Mhm.
was pretty darn busy.
Yeah,
But
yeah, right. And yes, that is the listeners. Yes, she did say the Purple Rain tour. Once again, well, this is all about Steve. But if you want to go to Susie's website, you can do that. But yeah, given that was so big, he must have been, he must have been telling everybody about his sister and what she was doing at that time for sure.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to this. Maybe some things about his personality, some things that came up in the
Hmm.
months before he went missing. You did, of course, already talk about him being confrontational, outspoken. Is this something genetic, environmental? How would you portray it?
Yeah, well, my dad had a bit of a temper when we were growing up, and so, having being quick to anger is probably more of a learned behavior than genetic. Um,
Hmm.
Yeah, and as far as me personally, I mean, aside from a few instances where he got mad because he
Yeah,
lost at a board
yeah.
game, he wasn't confrontational with me at all.
Okay.
Um, but I did my brother Scott he told me that when Steve was in high school, he would get together with his friends and they'd go looking for people to have fights with. And I was like, what? I'd never heard that.
Oh my.
and
Wow. Okay.
and And with my brothers, his temper was much more likely to surface. So those guys would express a lot of anger towards each other, and a lot of their relationship was kind of around competing and, who's going to win and so I
Hmm.
think there was definitely some of that need to be the winner, need to be the best, need to be the toughest, need to be the fastest sort of thing with the boys, definitely more than with me.
Yeah. Okay. And I once again, some of these things you're describing, I see in myself too. So that doesn't happen too often when we talk about missing people, but there's some things that ring true here.
Yeah.
What about moving to San Francisco? Once again, you had your own life, you were doing your own thing. I realized that he didn't, he maybe didn't go to you and ask you for your opinion on all this. But what do
Yeah.
you understand now about him moving from his hometown, moving to San Francisco, his choice to move out and do his own thing, live on his own? What do you understand about that now?
Well, he decided to get a job, and he had a friend named Henry that he met through. There's a religious practice called Ekankar that my mom is into, and so she'd kind of pulled Steve into that. And so he met Henry, and I guess Henry had a room, and I don't know if Henry's room came first or the bike messenger job came first, but It was just, I think he was ready to be out on his own. It was 1984 when he first started working as a bike messenger.
Okay.
So he would have been 21 then, I think. So
Okay.
it seemed totally natural.
All right. So he just moved out. Time for him to move out. It wasn't necessarily for example, it wasn't a reason anything in bad going on at home. He just felt, you know what?
Yeah.
Just time to move out, live on my own, go San Francisco is a, interesting place, big city. And maybe I should
Mhm.
ask you this, how far it was this from where he grew up to San Francisco? How far?
Oh, well, this only the Fairfax to the city's 30
All
minutes.
right, so not far, but still
Yeah.
moving into the city.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
All right. Would you say in general your mother, being that he was living at home, she was felt fine with that? She just
Yeah. Yeah. Also, she knew Henry through the mutual spiritual
right.
practice. So
Okay. And did you tell me in a prior conversation was Henry the opera singer? Is that
yeah, and in fact, we're trying to remember Henry's last name because he's evidently still, he lives in the Netherlands and he's still
oh,
performing and is a
wow.
successful singer with the opera over there.
Wow, so another successful musician. That's interesting. Okay, so he knows Henry. He moves down there now. Though even though he knew Henry, he was living by himself. Then he got his own place, or they were
No,
roommates
he
for a little
moved,
while.
no, he lived with Henry out in the avenues on 22nd Avenue
Okay,
for a while.
okay,
And then he ended up getting his own place.
okay.
Yeah.
Now that brings up being at his own place, though. I don't know if it was a coincidence. Maybe you can explain it if you know. How did it end up? You've already mentioned this friend George. How did he
Hmm.
end up also kind of living in the same area or just very close? Or how did that all end up? Was that a coincidence or was that some arrangement that those two guys made? Do you even know?
Well, that actually didn't happen. This is
Oh,
a
it
good,
didn't.
yeah,
Okay.
this is a good example of that. That's what my mom told me, and that's what she remembered. But I
Okay.
talked to George himself. He said he didn't live there, but
Huh.
he was friends with the landlady. And so maybe that's how Steve heard about the apartment.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. But George,
Yeah.
did he not live in the city then? Did he live somewhere else or
He
do we know?
was he said that he thinks he was living at his brother's part-time at that point. I have notes from my conversation with him. He wasn't exactly sure where he was, but he was sure that he didn't live in the same building as Steve, which was something I'd heard from my mom.
Okay. So it's then possible, this is just an example, that Steve's living with Henry. Steve wants to get his own place. He knows George from way back in the day in elementary school. George says, you know what? I know a woman that has a room in the city if you want to move into it. And that's how Steve found this place. Possible.
Yeah, that sounds right. Mhm.
Okay, very good. All right. Now, you talked about this bike messenger job, but eventually he ended up working for Chevron, the oil
Mhm.
company. What was he doing there for them? What was he doing?
He was in the mail room, sorting the mail,
Okay. All
and
right.
probably delivering it from department to department.
Okay. All right. Very good.
'Cause
So he goes from Mike Messenger to that. And do we have any idea how long he was at that job before he went missing? Any idea?
Chevron, no, I would have to double check. He was there at least 6 months, maybe a year, but all those exact dates are very hard to put together. He also had a job working at a bread shop for a while in there somewhere.
Oh,
So there's a whole period around, between 82 and 86 where we're a little unsure of what job was where,
okay.
was
That's
when.
fine. Your impression was Steve having a good time in San Francisco? Do you think that, once again, the way you understand it, the way your mother talked about it, maybe your other brothers talked about it, were things going the way he thought they would in San Francisco?
I don't really know. I remember my mom saying that the last time she saw him, that seemed that he felt burdened to her, like he didn't feel light and joyful, like he kind of had a heaviness around him, like there was something he was troubled about. And but it wasn't discussed. But it was just an impression that she got. And so that would have been sometime in 96, 86, sorry.
Okay. All right. Now, regarding maybe these statements, he did make a couple of them, and we certainly need to talk about them. The first one is, if I said something to your mother about if I go missing for a while, don't worry about me. Was this something that came out quickly after he went missing, or how do you remember that? What do we know about that?
Well, after he went missing, Mom told all of us that he'd called her, maybe 6 months before. She couldn't remember exactly because at the time she didn't really, put that, she wasn't that alarmed by what he said, but he basically called her and said, hey, if I were to ever disappear for a while, I don't want you to worry about me. I'm going to be, I'll be fine. And she sort of took it as, him saying, like, life is hard sometimes. And sometimes I just wish I could, start all over again someplace else. And, so that's kind of what she said to him. She said, well, sometimes I feel that way too. And she was just sort of, sympathetic with his emotions and didn't really, think much about it until he disappeared. And then she told us that, and we really latched on because it just, the whole, him disappearing out of the blue, like with no evidence of any crime whatsoever. It was just too hard to fathom. Like, what the, how does somebody just disappear? And so we really were invested in that. And, it's so sad in retrospect, but we all were so sure he would just come back. That he disappeared in October 31st of 1986. And at Christmas time, like, I got him Christmas presents and they were under the tree for him, because a part of me was like, oh, for sure he'll be home by Christmas, right? And then no sign, no word. My mom's birthday was March 19th, and it was just like holding out this hope. It's like, oh, for sure he's going to call my mom. Like, I just couldn't go to the place of he has been murdered and he's gone. There was no evidence to point to that at all. How does it, I mean, he's a big guy. How does a big body like that just disappear? So anyway,
So this is a comment that he made that maybe beforehand was just like, early 20 something guy, maybe having some angst or something, and then after the fact it became something serious. Like, oh, okay,
yeah,
okay.
it's like, oh, we really believe that's what happened, that he just left.
Okay.
you know
Now, he did say, he went even further than that once again in my notes. Of course, we've talked several times that he even asked, I think, was it one of your brothers about getting, or maybe a friend of his, he asked about getting a different or new social security number. When did this come out?
Well, we found out about this from my first cousin Grant, who, after Steve disappeared, wrote us a letter, and he said, hey, when I was with Steve like a couple summers ago, like it had, it hadn't been a recent thing. Steve was sort of just pondering, like, wow, I wonder what it would take to get a new social security number. And it kind of led Grant to believe that he was contemplating this idea of creating a new identity or disappearing somewhere. So Grant told us that. And then, of course, that just tied right in with what Steve had told my mom. And we're like, oh, wow. It was another part of the equation that made us a little less, what I think we were unfortunately not as proactive in trying to locate him ourselves, and just, sort of letting police follow leads and things like that. Because we all just kind of believed he disappeared himself on a lark and he'd show up any day.
Show up any day.
Yeah.
Once again, in all the years since, have you ever discovered that he's brought up these topics to anybody else? Once again, besides your mother, did he talk to anybody else about thinking about going away for a while, or did he talk to anybody else about, a new social security number, or was it
Yeah.
just seemingly with these two people?
Just those two people, but that kind of makes me want to reach out to his friend George, who I've been in touch with recently. So that'd be a good question for me to ask.
Okay, so we have these things. Could be nothing. As an example, we know sometimes people have called like suicide hotlines, and
Mhm.
they don't end up committing suicide. Nothing happens.
Right.
People. We talk about it on the program. Sometimes women will say, if I go missing, it's because you need to go look at John Smith, and she doesn't go missing. So and then sometimes women do go missing after saying
Yeah.
something like that. So it's just hard to say, but I can certainly understand in the moment that maybe people were just thinking this is just Steve talking. Maybe he's just a
Mm-hmm.
little down, depressed, and it's really nothing, and he'll just move past it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to this. Now, you said that he didn't have any, intimate relationships or anything like that. Once again, to your knowledge, we realized that you had your own life at the time. But there was this woman, Janice, that he met once he got to San Francisco. Was this a woman that your family knew about before he went missing, or did she kind of just pop up after the fact? And what can you tell the audience about Janice?
I don't. Okay, so I only found out about Janice after Steve went missing. He was a woman that he had been dating for a while, and evidently really liked. And her, but she was married, and her husband was in jail.
Wow.
So when her husband was getting ready to come out of jail, Janice told Steve, "I can't see you anymore." And this was upsetting to Steve, but he agreed to it. And I, I believe I talked to Janice back then,
Yeah.
and she was very concerned about Steve, and worried about what had happened to him after she found out that he disappeared. And of course, that was suspicious that her
Yeah.
husband had been in jail and was getting out, and
Yeah.
so police went and they interviewed her and him, and they decided that he wasn't any kind of a suspect in this.
Okay. Do you know how Janice and Steve even knew each other?
We do not know that. We don't
Okay.
know how.
They might have just run into each other. Maybe he met her while he was a bike messenger at some building. Maybe she worked at Chevron. Maybe he ran into her local coffee shop or through his music. We just don't
No, don't know.
know. Okay. All right. But she was married to a felon and he was in jail at the time. So, of course, that's something that's going to be on people's minds. We certainly understand that the police looked into that, and we'll certainly um, come back to that a little later. So he did have this. How did like Janice reveal herself? Once again, the way you understand it, did Janice reveal herself after Steve went missing, or did like one of Steve's
Mm,
friends know about her? Like they tracked her down. Do we even know how she even popped up into Steve's life as part of this?
I don't even know how we heard about her. That's
Okay.
a good question.
Okay. Well, that might be something you need to look into.
Mhm.
And maybe that, obviously, if she came forward after the fact, that would certainly, I think, cause us to believe that she had nothing to do with his disappearance. Somebody who would just voluntarily come forward and say, "Oh yeah, I'm concerned," But if she had to be tracked down, then that, of course, might mean
Oh no,
something
we
else.
no. She was very concerned about Steve.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I'm the one who talked to her.
Okay. All right. So, but he did have this woman in his life. Of course, the big concern is she was married. Okay. Let's move on to this. We're just going to talk about a couple people. In fact, we've kind of already mentioned them, but I think the listeners do need to understand a little more deeply who these two were, and it's going to get a little confusing because unfortunately, one of them has the same name as Steve, but you've already mentioned him, and we've come across a couple different spellings of his name, but we'll do our best. Steve Haverness. You've mentioned him. My understanding is he had something to do with your brother Steve with music or something. What do you understand about just in general Steve
Mhm.
Haverness? Have you ever met him? Did you ever meet him before Steve went missing? Did he grow up with Steve? What can you tell the listeners?
Yeah, they met in middle school, and Steve Havernass was, we'll just call him Havernass. How's that?
Okay, that's
Yeah.
fine.
So he was one of Steve's best friends from middle school through high school. Um, and I don't remember ever meeting him. And, I do know Steve Habernas had a recording studio in his house. So he was a musician as well as my brother.
Mhm. And they did some recording together?
Yes. So, well, I know that Steve's friend George and Steve and my brother Sean all went over to Habernass's house sometime in the fall of 1986 and made a recording in his recording studio.
Okay. Steve, it's interesting to me, of course, maybe in the 21st century, start talking about recording studios, and we know people can record from home just onto their, MacBooks or whatever else using
Mhm.
GarageBand, which is what I also use for this podcast. But of course, back in the 1980s, things a little different. It could get very expensive back then. So Steve
Yeah.
had a recording studio set up in there. That's
Oh,
of course, you're in the
probably
music
just
business, so maybe does that sound surprising to you, or what?
no. That was the time where things like Fostex 8 tracks were coming. So there were things
Mhm.
you could set up a decent recording studio. I don't know what quality the studio was, but
Mhm.
yeah, you could. People were starting to make home recordings at that time.
Okay, very good. And
Probably,
Steve, please.
it's probably just more of a home studio.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Steve, though he did not live in San Francisco, did he still live in the area where you all grew up?
Well, and Habernas?
Yes, please. Yeah, Haverness. I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Yes,
he,
Haverness. Yes, please.
yeah, he lived in Larkspur. His parents had both had died very young, and they'd left their house to him. So he owned a house in Larkspur Canyon.
Wow. And he was
Hmm.
around Steve's age and already owning his own house and all
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Hmm.
All right. All right, so that's how Steve knew Havernass. Steve Havernass, we're calling him Havernass. Thank you for reminding me, Susie. But Havernass does not live in San Francisco, but he knew Steve for quite a while. They did some recordings together. I guess, just doing a recording. Did they actually play live anywhere? Did they actually have a band, or was this just messing
Yeah.
around with recordings? Yeah.
No, Steve and George and Sean all played at my wedding reception in the
Wow.
summer of '86, and I have videos of that with
Wow.
cousin Grant on drums.
Neat.
Hmm.
Neat. Okay. That I didn't know that. I'm first hearing about that. We might all be interested to see some of that if you were willing to show some of your wedding video that's from 1986. And I'm 51, so the 80s are, right there in my mind. I graduated high school in 89, so I
Hmm.
remember them well. So that's interesting. Okay. So, of course, we've talked about George. We understand that he knew this woman who had a place that Steve could live, and they knew each other from elementary school as well. But what would you say regarding George and Havernass? What's again your understanding? Were they two close friends as well as Steve was close with him, or were they, not as
No,
close?
they weren't close. They were both friends with Steve, but they didn't hang out just on their own.
Okay. All right. All right, so that's the two guys that we will be talking about a little later, more in depth, especially coming back in particular to Havernass. A couple questions for you. Of course, you see them in the outline that we are following for this interview.
Hmm.
It believed, of course, he went missing seemingly on Halloween, October 31st, 1986. Did Steve tell someone that he was going to see his mother that weekend of Halloween? So the 31st, November 1st, November 2nd. Did he tell somebody that? Was that something that people thought he was going to do that weekend?
Yeah. I think he told a couple of people. He evidently told my mom's roommate, Frank, who was also a good family friend, that he would be coming up for the weekend. And he called my brother Scott and said that he would be up and was planning on spending Halloween night with Scott.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay, so that very Friday. Okay,
Hmm.
and then once again for the listeners, Halloween 1986 was on a Friday. However, we also have this story. Maybe it's, I don't know if it's in contrast to that or, the opposite of that. Maybe the two can be rationalized somehow. But did Steve tell somebody else that he was going to Haverness's party, a Halloween party that Haverness was having at this house? Um, and in the process of doing that, he was going to be picking up some tape. Who did Steve tell this to? And do you see maybe those two stories as being the opposite? Do they conflict in some way, or is it possible that both could be true the way you look at it now?
Yeah, no, my mom actually knew that Frank, what Steve had relayed to Frank was that he was going to stop at Steve Haverness's house, do a little work on the tape, like maybe do some mixing on the tape, and then come up to my mom's house. So they knew he was stopping at Steve Haverness's house.
All right, so
And then he
was
told George that he was going to go pick up the tape, do a little work on it, but that also Haverness was having a Halloween party that night and he was going to attend it. So I don't think it's definitely in conflict. Like, he could have been, oh, I'm going to go pick up the tape, go up to my mom's, hang out with my brothers. Then he found out there's a party. He's like, oh, I'll go pick up the tape, go to the party for a little bit, and then go up to my mom's. So I think it's, kind of the
it's very
same story.
possible that all could have happened all in one night.
It's possible, yeah.
All right, because we have to remember, and this is something that I guess we need to talk about, is that Steve did work that Friday at Chevron, that Halloween, October 31st. He was in San
Hmm.
Francisco. He went to work. And in fact, I think you told me in a prior conversation that um, there was some comment made that, Steve was doing a good job at work or something like that. What
My
can you say about
mom's my mom spoke to his supervisor, and his supervisor said that Steve had come up to him that Friday and said he'd had his best day at work ever.
Huh. Okay. All
Hmm.
right. And that was on that Friday. So we have to realize maybe he gets out of work at 4 o'clock. He has this good day at work or good week at work, gets out of work maybe sometime in the afternoon, and his plan is to go eventually end up back in his hometown. How would he
Hmm.
have been doing that? He didn't have a car, so how would he have been going from San Francisco? And like you said, it's not that far, but still a half hour. You wouldn't want to walk it.
No,
Um,
no, there's a bus that, I mean, the bus up goes right up through Larkspur, so that's kind of right on the way, and then you just catch another bus to Fairfax. So I'm sure he was bussing it.
okay, so
Yeah.
the plan was believed to be that he would get off work, get on the bus, go to Havernas's first, or maybe second, but eventually end up in your hometown to see your family, specifically your mother.
Yeah, that's what my brother Scott
Okay.
expected would happen, because that's what Steve told him would happen.
Okay.
Hmm.
Now, of course, we know that he did not show up
Hmm.
back in his hometown to see your mother, to see anybody else. And at the time, how did your mother, for example, react? She thinks he's coming up. Of course, he doesn't end up there on October 31st, not on
Hmm.
November 1st, not on November 2nd. How does she react? What did she do?
I don't remember. I'd have to ask her, but I think she just, made the assumption that Steve had changed his plans. He had not reached out to her personally. She'd only heard about it through other people. So I think she decided not to be worried about it. Um, and then on Monday, she got a call from Steve's supervisor at work who said Steve hadn't showed up for work. And so that's when she called George, Steve's friend who lived in the
Yeah.
city, and said, hey, can you go by and just, see
Mhm.
what's going on? And George went and looked in the window of Steve's apartment, and everything, there was no sign of any break-in or anything that
Okay.
looked out of the ordinary.
All right. So once again, the accepted date all these years later of the disappearance is Halloween 1986. Steve
Mm-hmm.
has these plans. It doesn't, of course, he did not fulfill those plans, whatever he was planning to do. And it goes through the weekend. And we'll get back to this party in Haverness here in a moment. But your mother is thinking in particular that, well, maybe something came up.
Mm-hmm.
He is a grown man. Maybe she
Yeah.
was a little worried that he didn't call. My mother's now deceased, but I know that if I told her I was going to show up at her house and I didn't show up, she would of course worry about me. But this would be in the era of cell phones and everything, a lot
Right.
different than in
It's really,
1986. That makes
it
it.
was really different. I mean, we were all
Mhm.
just used to not being constantly in touch with each other,
Yeah,
you know.
and it was kind of nice, wasn't it, Susie? It was in a way, I guess. But so she just thinks, well, maybe something came up, but it's not until Monday, like you said, it was his work that called her.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then she has George's number. George is convenient for him. He goes over there, but he did not go into the apartment. He didn't have a key. He was just like looking in, like through the window or whatever, and just didn't see anything
Yeah,
unusual.
that's what he said, is that he just looked in the window.
Okay. Now, eventually, though, somebody did get into the apartment, maybe the landlord,
Uh,
and please.
well, the my mom went down on Wednesday, and the
Wow.
landlady let her in,
Hmm.
and nothing was out of place. All of Steve's instruments were there. There was a receipt for groceries that were paid for Friday afternoon, and a few things in the fridge. And there was a Saturday morning edition of the paper that was there, which
Okay.
could have been purchased Friday night
Okay.
or Saturday morning.
Yeah.
Hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So once again, this receipt shows October 31st on it. We have this early edition newspaper. Maybe it's delivered very early on November 1st, maybe
Well,
very early.
purchased.
Yeah, purchased
Purchased.
very early Saturday morning. So it seems that, yes, he went to work and maybe he stopped for groceries on the way home, made it home. The receipt's there, so I guess the
Mhm.
food was there too, and then something happens after that. But there certainly wasn't any signs of violence. There wasn't any signs that somebody broke in to the
No,
place. What about Steve's possessions, like his wallet? Was his wallet there? Of course, we can't talk about
no,
cell phones yet. Wallet
no.
wasn't
His wallet and his jean jacket were gone. So he'd evidently left the
there. Mhm.
apartment on his own.
Okay. And of course, there was no break in. It sounds like you said there were instruments there, maybe things that people could steal that might have some value. All of those things were there. So it just seems like maybe we could, as a possibility, yeah, he's planning to go catch the bus to ride it home and something happens.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of what it looks like. Okay, what do the police do? Before we started this interview, we were just both talking about how families maybe take too much for granted on the work that police are actually going to do regarding a disappearance. That is not just true in 1986; it is true to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, who ends up filing the missing persons report? And really, did the police do much at the time at all?
Well, initially, I think, once they talked to everybody, my mom told them what Steve had said to her about, maybe disappearing sometime. And so it probably did not help with their urgency about investigating. But I mean, we were in regular contact with them. I remember the officer's name was Irene Dunn. And they followed leads. They interviewed a lot of people. I know they talked to George. I know they talked to Janice. They said they talked to Janice's husband.
Yeah.
And we did kind of just trust that they were interviewing any possible leads that could have been associated with his disappearance.
Mhm. Do you know? I know this is a very technical question, but do you know if they went to like the bus station and never passed this picture around? Hey, did anybody see? Of course, now we're talking maybe a week later at a bus stop or a bus station somewhere. It's going to be
Yeah,
a little
it,
difficult, but do you know that if they even attempted that?
no, I don't. And it would have just been a bus stop.
Okay, bus stop.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so the police do what they can, but as you stated, the apartment's locked, nothing's stolen, doesn't look like any signs of violence. He says he was
Mhm.
to go back to his hometown. We have these statements. The police are thinking maybe he just ran off. You know, if he's talking about social security
Mhm.
numbers and going missing for a while, that opens itself to a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
Okay. How well would you say that the police kept in contact with your family, you know, regarding any work being done on the case over all these years? And then we'll get into maybe more of the technicalities of some of this. How would you say?
Well, I think for the first, first couple of years, we had pretty active conversations with them, and then every once in a while, we would follow up. I know, God, about 8 years ago, they contacted us, and and myself and my brother Sean donated DNA. So now that's on file for Steve. Um, right now I'm having a hard time reaching anybody there.
Yeah.
And they say that there's only 2 officers handling all the missing persons cases, and so I'm sure that a case from 1986 is not top priority. So it's hard to get any additional information at this point.
Yeah, and as I've told you, I've covered at least two other disappearances from San Francisco. Cameron Remmer, which is a very long episode that came out at the end of 2020, that where the police have not been helpful, and that's just a disappearance within the last 10 years. And then another disappearance, kind of like Cameron's, Jackson Miller's. Once again, it got to the point with both of those that some of the families were trying to get petitions filed to get investigators fired and everything
Mm.
else. So that's maybe a little bit what you're talking about here about trying to contact them and them not being very helpful. Now we should talk about this though. We know that Steve said he was going to be going to this party. He was going to be picking up this recording tape. Did the police speak to Havernass, Steve Havernass, and did George talk to Havernass? Did you or anybody in your family personally talk to Havernass about this
Mm.
party after you found out about all of it? What did Havernass say about this party? Was he not worried that Steve didn't show up? Or what can you say about Habernass's reaction to this entire thing?
I don't, gosh, I really hope the police interviewed him, but that's one thing I can't really clarify until I get a look at the file. I would assume they did. Uh, but yeah, I don't really know. I know that George went by Habernass's house a couple weeks after Steve's disappearance and said, "Hey, Steve is missing," and kind of felt that Habernass didn't seem very concerned. He was kind of like, "Yeah, what do you want me to, and what am I supposed to do about it?" And he was sort of surprised by that. There's So we have no evidence if he actually made it to the party or not,
Okay.
which is that would have really been good to know.
Okay. So I guess maybe as an example, if it was believed that Steve was supposed to show up at Habernass's party, Steve doesn't show up. There are no records that over that weekend, let's say November 1st, November 2nd, that Habernass tried to call Steve, tried to call your mother. Hey, being that he might have suspected that Steve was going to his mother's. Hey, Steve, why didn't you show up at my party on Friday night? You were supposed to show up. You kind of stood me up here. There's no proof that Habernass ever did anything like that. Is there?
No, no, there is not.
Okay. Has anybody ever given that this party allegedly happened, George or anybody else who might have been more in tune with all of this, ever been able to track down anybody who was at that Halloween party that Havernass allegedly threw?
Nope.
Okay, so all we have is, I guess, Steve saying that he thought that Havernass was having this party, but we just still, all these years later, and I got to say once again, it seemed to me, being that Havernass was friends with Steve, it seems to me they would have at least some mutual friends that would be
Mm-hmm.
at this party. None of those people who would have known your brother
Yeah.
have ever come forward and said, you know what? I was at Havernas's party in 1986.
Yeah.
I was 23 at the time. And yes, we were expecting Steve to show up, but he didn't. Nobody in the last 36 years almost has ever come forward to say that.
No, I mean, I have to say, I didn't know the story about the party until only recently myself.
Huh. And how did you
Somehow
find out about it?
I found out from George.
Okay. But we should be clear on something, though. George was not invited to this party.
No, and did not attend. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess what we're saying, and in fact, I think you told me that Steve tried to get George to go to this party, but George didn't want to go because he wasn't invited.
Yes, that's what George told me.
Okay. All right. So there's this party that we just don't have a lot of proof of it right now. We're not saying it didn't happen, but it would certainly, it would certainly feel a lot better about this if there were people who came forward here in the 21st century to say, you know what, I did go to that party. And yeah, Steve wasn't there, because otherwise you start to think, did this party happen or not? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, that would be really great. I'd love to see the police report and see if they actually talked to Habernas, found out who was at his house that night, and talked to anybody.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a feeling they didn't.
Okay. All right. But all right. So we have this, and like on top of everything else, um, Habernas, in George's opinion, once again, you and I weren't there, but in George's opinion, Habernas maybe did not show the concern that you think someone would have.
That's just what George
That's just
came
George's
away with.
impression. It
Yeah.
very well may be, if you get to speak to Habernas one of these days, that it's totally different. But
Yeah.
being the George knew Steve as well as anybody, his reaction was that, I just thought Habernas could have acted a little bit differently. Now, regarding, now we should mention this. Steve did keep a diary. It was found, I guess, in his place. Anything in it that could have forecasted what happened here? We've talked about diaries at least a few times over the last 250 disappearances that we've covered. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. What would you say about Steve's diary that he was keeping?
It wasn't a diary. He had a bunch of notebooks, and I looked through them recently, hoping to find
Yeah.
some personal tales. But like I mentioned before, his journals were all creative writing, as assigned,
Okay.
just attempts, just wild stories of fantasy, and then lists about like all of the fights Mike Tyson ever had and the scores that he got.
Huh.
So very, very little personal stuff. He didn't really write down personal things.
Okay, so we have these lists. Would he write like lyrics to songs, being that he was a musician? Were the lyrics maybe that he was messing around with, ideas for songs in there as well?
Yeah, and yeah, we do have a lot of his songs. We have
Wow.
about 30 songs of his of demos that he did at home. And I
Wow.
do have printed lyrics, but I haven't really reviewed lyrics looking for, anything.
Any hidden messages? Any hidden messages? Maybe you could just get. Of course, not going to ask you to read. Would never ask you to read any of the lyrics. I guess they're private. But would you say that the subject matter was, just maybe to get into his state of mind? Would you say the topics of these lyrics were dark, or were they more joyful? Were they more
They're
Black
pretty,
Sabbath? Were they more Black Sabbath, or were they more Van Halen? I
no,
guess is though what I'm trying to say.
no, pretty playful, he loved Lennon, and so John Lennon loved the Beatles. So of course, his subjects tended to be stuff more like that. But I'd be interested in rereading his lyrics. It's been a while since I've done it. Like one of his songs is a song about his cousin. It's called Grant Got Whipped with the Vacuum Cleaner, and it's about when he was a small boy and my grandmother took the vacuum cleaner and
Oh my
spanked
goodness.
cousin Grant with it. So
Oh
it's
my
just,
goodness. Well, that's kind of
yeah,
funny.
It is funny.
Yeah, it's okay. Maybe not funny at the time for Grant, but certainly funny to write about something like that. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Now, I do have in my notes, though, that on October 31st, regarding going back to what is accepted as the disappearance date, did your brother Sean speak to Steve that day?
I am unsure. I'm unsure. I'd have to clarify with him. But
Okay,
he too was under the impression that Steve was coming up for the weekend.
okay. All right, so I had that in my notes. I wanted to bring that up, that maybe your brother Sean spoke to him. So we're just not quite sure about that. All we know is that Steve had talked to your mother like earlier in the week. Yeah, I'm coming up, and then he mentioned to George about this party and invites George. So it certainly seems one way or the other that Steve was getting out of San Francisco that weekend. That was his plan, no matter where he was going.
That was his plan. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, regarding this tape, that was made. And like you stated, Haverness had this recording studio that these guys would get together and play, and that Steve was going to go there to get this tape. Now, George, though, as you told me in a story that he told you, he showed up at Haverness's. Maybe this is the first time he showed up at Haverness's after Steve went missing. And the topic of this tape came up. What did
Hmm.
George tell you about this tape and what Haverness said when it was brought up?
George said he wanted to get the tape, and Haverness said he didn't know where it was. And then they started talking about the kind of work George was doing, and George is doing some sort of construction. And Haverness said, hey, I need some help over here. Maybe you want to do some construction work for me and trade for recording studio time, and then you could look for that tape.
Huh. Uh, I have to say, once again, neither of us are there with that for that conversation, but just once again, it just doesn't seem like Haverness was that concerned.
Yeah, it
It's
doesn't.
it's a little bit of a flippant comment. Well, yeah, if you want to trade for services or something, yeah, then we can go like look for this tape.
Yeah,
Where,
it's a little,
where could it be? You know what I mean?
yeah,
What is it under a couch cushion?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. That's just a weird story. But something else regarding Haverness, once again, something that we've talked about, so I need to ask you about it. Was there an issue of a money situation between Steve and Haverness?
God, my mom told me that Haverness owed Steve some money, but I don't know if that's actually true.
Hmm.
I don't know
Can
if
you
that's
could you think of any reason, once again, the way you understand their friendship, could this have been it seemed to me if Haverness has the recording studio, it would be that maybe Steve would owe Haverness money, maybe
yeah.
paying not the opposite, but this
No,
is what
that
your
doesn't
mother
make
said, so I
it,
have to ask you about it.
it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so we're just not, once again, this is something we're just not sure about it. It very well could be
Yeah.
true, and if it's true, then maybe something did go on, and sometimes disappearances do happen due to differences in money and people owing
Hmm.
money. That happens. But we don't
Yeah.
have a lot of facts to back that up. I'm not saying your mother's lying. She may very well be telling the truth, but there's not a lot of
Hmm.
context to that story.
There's not. Yes, and this is a great morality tale. If something mysterious happens in your life, take notes.
Yeah, right. Totally true.
Don't just trust that you're going to remember what people
Yes.
say, man.
Yep.
Jesus,
Yep.
it's been quite a process trying to get everybody's stories to match up, even though we all
Right.
experience the same thing. We all have slightly different takes on it, you
Right.
know?
That's right. That's totally true. And
Hmm.
on top of it, and I will tell you, one of the reasons people don't do that is because they never think that a disappearance is going to last 36 years. They don't
Right.
think that the mystery, yes, it may get resolved, and John Smith may end up may be found deceased. Unfortunately, very sad. But they don't think it's going to be 36 years later. They maybe think it's going
Right.
to be a year later, and so you don't write anything down. But it becomes an issue after 30 some years.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We my mother had Steve declared deceased. in the 90s. She just did not believe that he would never contact her, that he would disappear and never contact with her. And so, that was a bit of I think it brought some finality to it, even though, I'm still open to the possibility that he's alive. But at that point, I think, we stopped really actively pursuing this case.
Yeah. Right. And of course, also the tough part, and we have still have a few more topics to cover. Unfortunately, I think when people think San Francisco and people going missing, they automatically think, did he go to the Golden Gate Bridge and jump? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be something. It's very natural. Golden Gate Bridge is the number one spot for suicides in the United States. I will
Mm-hmm.
tell you that I've covered two disappearances in that area, and I will tell you in both of those situations, those two men, young men, were in much had riskier lifestyles. They had some mental health issues, etc. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe either of them went to the Golden Gate Bridge. There's no proof of any of that. And I've looked at three other disappearances, kind of the same way. I don't believe those three other young men they went off the bridge either. So I'm not inclined to believe that Steve did that either. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem is San Francisco has a reputation because of the
Right.
Golden Gate Bridge, and that's why now they've built that net under it and everything else.
Yeah.
So, of course, that's something. It very well may be something that was in the police department's mind back in 1986.
No, I don't think so. There
You
was
don't think
no,
so?
no, there's
Okay.
no reason to expect that.
Okay. Okay. Given that you've spoken to George very recently, and I think it's spectacular that you could talk to somebody who saw Steve and was very friends with very good friends with Steve, and spoke to him not long before he went missing. Has he, if you feel you can say, has he ever offered up his own theory as to what happened to Steve?
He's always been worried that something happened at the party,
Okay.
and that's why Steve didn't make it to my mom's, but there's no evidence.
All right, but that's been his theory. Do you think that is something, once again, being that you've been talking to him, is this something that he came upon very quickly in 1986, or do you get the feeling this is something just he's thought recently?
No, I think he's thought it all along.
Okay,
Hmm.
very good. Now, we did mention Janice, and unfortunately, I've learned that she is deceased. She's no longer with us. So, whatever she knew, if she knew anything, uh, went
Hmm.
to the grave with her. But this guy who was her husband, his name is James Lilly. He is still alive. Has have you or anybody the police recently any idea maybe gotten back in contact with him? My understanding is that he was in jail back and then for some drug issues of some type. Any news about him since he got out of jail in 1986 at all?
No, none.
None. Okay. And finally, there is another woman you mentioned her name, young woman. I'm guessing at the time her name is Rosalinda.
Hmm.
Who is she? Is this just some other girl that Steve had met when he
Yeah.
went to San Francisco? How did her name even pop up? Was she questioned? What is her status in all of this?
Well, I don't know her. My mom doesn't know her. I don't know if she was questioned. I'm
Hmm.
sorry, I don't have
That's all right.
any more
But how did
information.
you find out about her? How do we even know her name?
Well, when Steve went missing, we did sort of compile a list of like contacts, people who knew him. I'm not sure who did that. I was on tour.
Hmm.
I was out and about
Yeah.
when this happened.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was done by my father, my mom. I'm not exactly sure how we knew about her.
Okay, so her name just kind of popped up somehow. Maybe George knew her. Maybe he had seen her over at maybe at Steve's place one time, in San
Yeah.
Francisco. Is she given that we have this? I called it a diary, but more like a journal or a series of notebooks. Could she have been mentioned in there, do you think? Do you think her name's in there anywhere?
Um,
Any
I
idea?
don't,
Don't know. Okay.
sorry.
Okay. The only thing I have, once again, in my notes regarding her is that she was out of town when this all happened. That's got the only um, thing. And I
No, I don't.
actually,
Oh, I
please.
don't know. I
You don't
really don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, so these are all topics we've covered. I'm not going to release her last name, but her first name was Rosalinda. I did look her up, try to see if she had a criminal record or anything. Couldn't
Mm-hmm.
not really, find anything. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so once again, we have a situation. This young man says he's going to be going back to his hometown, has some plans, doesn't end up there. And
Mm-hmm.
the issues we have here is that first of all, he was having a relationship with a married woman, and let's just be clear: this James Lilly, he did get out of jail shortly before Steve went missing.
Yes, he did. Yeah. I don't know exactly the extent of their relationship either. I don't know if it was sexual or just, flirtatious. I can't say.
Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
then we have Havernass, who there's some questions there, and that will all be for the listeners to, decide and listen to all this and kind of figure out what they think happened. And then we have Steve's own comments where it sounded like he just might have been looking to go off on his own.
Right.
How did this disappearance affect your family back in 1986, Susie, and how has it continued to do that to this day?
Well, we were just devastated. We couldn't, it's just so surreal when that happens. It's just it's heartbreaking. And we were, super worried, but also really clinging on to this hope that, you know, he would just, he was off on a lark.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and, my family has stayed pretty tight since then. I see my brothers pretty regularly, Sean and Scott, and I'm in touch with both my folks who are still alive. And like I said, Mom had Steve declared deceased, and she needed to do that for her own peace of mind. Um, so yeah, it's just a terrible loss and just completely mystifying. But I think you know in our hearts we've all pretty much decided that somebody murdered him, because there's just no other explanation. And
Right.
we just don't know how it happened. There was that very strange story about Larry Swimmer, who was abducted off of the streets of San Francisco by a bunch of guys in a van who tied him up and threw him in the bay.
Yes, we talked
And
about that. I did not have my notes. I'm glad you brought it up. But yes, there
yeah,
was a story about, and I looked this guy up. He's like a professor somewhere or something now. But
yeah, and that was right around the same time. And so, it's possible something horrible like that happened. Um, you know.
your understanding, being that you said that he would have gone to a bus stop to get a bus, he wouldn't have to go to a bus station. Uh,
Mhm.
what you know, if you even know, how far was the nearest bus stop from where he lived? How far would he have had to have walked to get there to the bus that, maybe it's a connection or something, to eventually get to your hometown? How
I
long,
I
please?
don't know. I'd have to look at his address and look at it on a
Mhm.
map, because I know where the Golden Gate Transit runs through the city, but I'd have to see. But I'm sure that was how he got around, and he was
Yeah,
probably pretty adept
right.
at the bus system.
And we have to remember, Steve, not a small guy, right? Not
No.
not somebody you would look as an easy victim.
Oh, he was around 6 feet.
Wow. Okay. So okay. All right. So there we have that. So maybe got caught walking. Once again, we don't do too much theorizing, but we have to consider all these possibilities, and I hope the listeners
Mm-hmm.
will do that.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any? Maybe I can ask you this: has Steve going missing? I don't know if you're a mother or not. If you have any children, has it affected you in any way, the way you go about your life since 1986, with having a brother who's gone missing, how has that affected maybe
Mhm.
your thoughts, your behavior over the last 30 some years?
Oh, wow. Well, um, I don't know that it's affected my behavior. Um, it is just a weird thing to have happen to you.
Hmm.
Um, it's for years and years, Steve would appear in dreams to me and he'd
Oh.
just walk into my dream and be like, hey, like what? like nothing, like what? So yeah, so I took off, but I haven't had a dream about him like that in a while. After a while you're you just get used to people being missing, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Of course, disappearances are in the news all the time. When you see the news, does it bring back bad memories? How does it affect you? Like, of course, we know all these, certain disappearances that seem to get national attention. Why they get
Mhm,
attention and all these other ones
mhm.
don't, I'm not sure. But, how does that affect you when you see something like that? Is there something that comes up in you emotionally when you see that, or?
Yeah, sure, it can be very triggering,
Yeah.
and I feel a lot of compassion for anybody going through that, losing a loved one.
Okay. Susie, do you have a Facebook page, website, anything like that set up for Steve's disappearance?
I do not. That's probably a pretty good idea.
That is, I would say that's a pretty good idea. I agree with you.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. I think, of course, on our Facebook page, the Unfound Podcast, Steve will eventually have his own page there for any,
Mhm.
articles, and, the episode itself will be there. And also on Spotify, the Spotify page. Now that Unfound is part of Spotify, he will have his own page over there as well. But you certainly should think about that.
Yeah.
It's easy enough to do. Probably the biggest thing is keeping updated. And as you know, with social media, you do get trolls, and no matter what we do out there, so you might get a little bit of that. But certainly, setting up a Facebook page would certainly raise the
Mhm.
profile, and that might be one of the easiest ways to start trying to track down any people that might have been at this Halloween party that Habermas allegedly had. Because I'm
Right.
sure if the party was even just 10 or 12 people, you can almost guarantee that half of them at least are on Facebook.
Yeah. You're right.
So something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
No,
just
it's
have
a
to
great idea. Great idea.
have to think about managing that. That's the big deal. Any final
Mhm.
words before we complete this interview, Susie?
No, just thank you for your energy behind this. It's been really interesting and a little bit painful to look back and to also see how, in retrospect, I wish that we had kept better notes as a family and written down exactly the words that people told us instead of just trying to remember them, because it's been quite a process to try and
Yeah.
get a real clear, concise story of exactly what happened when. So a hard lesson to learn, but that's what life is for, right?
Yeah, we learn a lot of lessons.
Mm,
Disappearances, though, are one of the toughest ones.
yeah.
I guess we're fortunate overall that they aren't that common. But on the other hand, being that they aren't that common, most people, of course, don't know what it's like to experience that.
Mhm.
And so there
Right.
might be a lack of understanding, a lack of compassion in certain. Well, people just say, "Well, that happens," but I know it's devastating to families. Devastating.
Yeah.
A lot of people, marriages, parents get divorced after their children go missing. You know, drug addiction starts popping up. Yeah, that's certainly a lot of collateral damage. Certainly,
Hmm. Yeah.
certainly. Well, I hope you will keep me informed on what's going on. I will always be a resource for you, Susie. Email me, call me. Things are going on. This is the only official conversation that we'll have. Anything from now on will go back to being off the record, just between us. And if I can help
Okay.
you in any way, of course, I will try to do that. anything, any experience that I have, any ways to get more information, I'll certainly pass that along to you.
Great.
You're very welcome, and I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay.
You're welcome. And that was my April 12th, 2022 interview with Susie Davis, sister of Steve Davis. I thank her for joining me and all of you on this episode. As a side note, I didn't feel it was appropriate to bring it up during the interview, and really, she and I have not hardly talked about it at all. But you should check out Susie's own website, susiedavis.com. She is living quite the musical life. Now, my summation. I think Steve's disappearance is a perfect example of the theme I selected for this episode. Why do people who don't have any of the qualities of people who go missing disappear? Right about now, though, you may be saying, but wait, Ed, he was getting together with that married woman. Isn't that a quality of a guy who could go missing? But wait, Ed, he had talked to some people about going out of contact for a while. That certainly increased Steve's chances of going missing, right? But wait, Ed, he lived in the city with the #1 suicide spot in the United States. That surely counts for something. All excellent points. Thank you for bringing them up. But allow me to put them in a totally different light. Regarding the married woman, it's not the end-all be-all of evidence, but the San Francisco Police Department looked into it and decided her husband had nothing to do with Steve's disappearance. Is it possible they got it wrong? Absolutely. However, their judgment at the time in 1986 has a lot more weight than our suspicions with no evidence in 2022. Moreover, if the husband was ticked off about his wife cheating on him, why didn't she disappear instead? Or to keep it simple, if the husband was ticked off at Steve, why cause Steve's disappearance? Why not just shoot him in his apartment? Regarding Steve's comments about going away and getting a new social security number, the problem we have is we weren't there. We didn't hear the conversations. Neither did Susie. And sure, Steve's mother and others could recount those talks, but that's not the same as being there in the moment. For example, I may talk to someone about going to the top of Mount Everest. Yet people who know me well know I hate the cold. I hate snow. And I surely hate hiking. When really, I only brought it up in conversation because the film Everest was on TV. In addition, when I think about people leaving their lives, I think of people who are being restricted in some way. They aren't being allowed to be who they want. My perception is the Davis family was the opposite of that. As for suicide, given the Golden Gate Bridge being so close, I see nothing in anything I've heard about Steve to consider it. Susie and the rest of her family completely dismiss the thought. And as I learned while watching the documentary about people who jump off the bridge, there were witnesses to almost all of the suicides. And as far as I know, there is no story from 1986 about a guy jumping off the bridge and not being found in the water below. That all leaves the Halloween party, the recording tape, and the trip home. If the party happened, why haven't people come forward to say, "Oh yeah, I thought Steve would be at the party," but he wasn't. Yet, I guess we have to believe the party happened because Steve invited George to it. Why would Steve invite George to a party that didn't exist. If George were to provide some names of people he thinks Haverness would have invited to that party, hey, he and Haverness knew each other from school too, then that could jumpstart this investigation 36 years later. What I'm saying is the other Frisco Kid could be the key to this disappearance. I'll leave the theorizing up to you.
And that's the program. Right now, while you are in your podcast platform, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever, give Unfound a 5-star review, a thumbs up, whatever that platform allows. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've just finished this episode of Unfound.